4:47 local time. A freight consist rolls south through the Kherson steppe, running dark. No passenger cars, no markings visible from the road. 32 cistern wagons, each loaded with diesel or aviation kerosene, moving under Russian military priority scheduling from a marshalling yard outside Melitopol toward the rail hub at Dzhankoy, in northern Crimea. The locomotive crew has made this run before. The track is familiar. The threat, they believe, is manageable. It is not. Open-source satellite imagery reviewed by independent analysts shows what happens next. A 600-meter corridor of scorched ballast, contorted steel cistern shells, and a burn scar wide enough to read from orbit. The Crimea rail line, the single most critical overland logistics artery feeding Russian airfields at Dzhankoy and Saki, goes silent for at least 9 days. Ukraine's HUR, the Military Intelligence Directorate, will later acknowledge the operation in general terms. What the imagery cannot show is how precisely it was planned, or how completely it unraveled a fuel distribution chain that Russian aviation in Crimea depended on. Here is how a rail echelon worth tens of millions of dollars ceased to exist before sunrise. To understand what Ukrainian planners were targeting, the strategic context matters. By late 2025, Russian air operations over southern Ukraine depended heavily on two airfields, Dzhankoy in northern Crimea and Saki on the western coast of the peninsula. Both fields hosted Su-30SM, multi-role fighters and reconnaissance aircraft conducting regular sorties over the Black Sea and toward Ukrainian positions in Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts. Both fields drew their aviation fuel, JP-8 equivalent kerosene and diesel for ground equipment, through the same rail corridor running north from the Kerch Strait crossing, through Dzhankoy, and onward toward the Russian-controlled territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. That corridor is a single-track line for much of its length through northern Crimea. Capacity is finite. Disruption compounds. Ukrainian military planners had studied it carefully. Western analysts tracking Russian logistics note that aviation fuel is not stockpiled in large quantities at forward airfields. The supply model is flow-based. Regular rail deliveries replace what sorties consume. Interrupt the flow for more than a week and sortie rates drop. Interrupt it longer and aircraft begin standing down. The math is straightforward. A Su-30SM conducting a 2-hour patrol burns approximately 3 to 4 tons of aviation kerosene per sortie. A single airfield running 10 sorties per day consumes 30 to 40 tons. The 32 cisterns rolling toward Dzhankoy that November morning represented, by volume estimates, enough fuel to sustain meaningful air operations for several days. Ukrainian intelligence understood this. The operation reportedly traced back months before the strike. Ukrainian HUR, Holovin Upravlinya Rozvidki, the main intelligence directorate, maintains a network of partisan assets in Russian-occupied territories, including in Crimea and the occupied portions of Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts. Open-source reporting and Ukrainian official statements from late 2025 describe ongoing sabotage operations against Russian rail infrastructure, with particular focus on fuel and ammunition logistics. The stretch of track near Novoaleksivka, a small settlement in the northern Kherson steppe just above the administrative boundary with Crimea, had been identified as a vulnerability, remote, lightly patrolled, on a curve that would maximize the kinetic effect of a derailment. A directional charge, the type used in partisan rail sabotage since the Second World War, updated with modern materials, was placed at a point calculated to strike the lead locomotive at speed, shifting its wheels off the rail and initiating a jackknife sequence through the first several wagons. Timing the detonation for the locomotive rather than a random wagon was deliberate. A locomotive derailment drags the trailing consist through the point of failure, piling cisterns into and over each other rather than scattering them across the steppe. The charge detonates. The locomotive leaves the rails at an estimated 60 to 70 kilometers per hour. The physics from this point are not favorable for the Russian crew or the cargo. The lead wagon's jackknife. Cisterns, each weighing approximately 20 tons fully loaded, override each other on the curved track, their shells compromising as they impact. Diesel ignites first. Aviation kerosene follows. Within minutes, Open-source accounts suggest the burn column is visible from several kilometers. But here is where the operation shifts from sabotage to something more systematic. Ukrainian FPV drone teams had been positioned within strike range of the track before the detonation. FPV, first-person view, drones in the Ukrainian operational model are not improvised weapons. By late 2025, Ukrainian production lines were delivering hardened FPV platforms specifically configured for infrastructure interdiction. Longer range than the battlefield anti-armor variants, carrying shaped warheads capable of penetrating cistern walls to initiate secondary fires and fuel that might otherwise burn off without destroying the tank itself. Open-source drone footage verified by independent analysts shows the characteristic high-angle diving attack profile of Ukrainian FPV teams operating against rail targets. A steep terminal approach designed to maximize warhead penetration angle on cylindrical surfaces. The sequence, as reconstructed from satellite imagery and open-source accounts, proceeded methodically. Cisterns that had not yet ignited were struck individually. Crews attempting to uncouple the burning wagons from intact portions of the consist. A standard emergency procedure to save what fuel remained, were working under fire. The uncoupling attempt, Ukrainian analysts later assessed, was only partially successful. Imagery confirms at least a majority of the 32 cisterns were consumed in the fire or rendered unserviceable by the strikes. One vehicle, a rail maintenance truck that had been moving on a parallel access road, appears to have reversed and departed the area before FPV teams could engage it. Why it was spared matters to understanding the Ukrainian operating procedure. FPV operators at this range prioritize the highest value fixed targets. A rail maintenance vehicle is worth less than a cistern containing several tons of aviation kerosene. The operators made the economically rational choice. The truck survived. The fuel did not. What's most surprising about this operation isn't the destruction itself. It's the precision of the sequencing. A directional charge timed for the locomotive, a follow-on FPV swarm pre-positioned before detonation, strike sequencing that prioritized unburned cisterns. This is not improvised. This reflects a targeting and coordination process that integrates partisan ground assets, drone teams, and likely satellite imagery confirmation into a single operational package. We spent time going through the open-source reconstruction of this strike, and one detail kept returning. The FPV teams were waiting. They were not called in after the derailment. They were already there. That level of coordination, between assets operating in physically separated locations across occupied territory, is a real departure from the early partisan sabotage operations of 2022 and 2023, which relied primarily on the ground charge alone and accepted that most of the fuel might survive in intact cisterns. Here is the tactical question the imagery alone cannot answer. How did Ukrainian teams know this specific consist, on this specific schedule, was carrying aviation fuel rather than general diesel or industrial supplies? Rail manifests in Russian-controlled territory are not published. Western analysts reviewing Ukrainian operational patterns assess the answer as a combination of human intelligence from partisan networks embedded in the Russian rail system, schedulers, yard workers, maintenance personnel, and signal intelligence intercepts of Russian military logistics communications. The fuel echelon was not selected at random. It was selected because someone, somewhere in the Russian rail and military supply chain, communicated its contents and schedule in a way that Ukrainian intelligence could read. This is the surveillance layer that precedes every successful deep interdiction strike. The drone and the charge are the visible part. The months of patient intelligence collection are not. The battle damage assessment, drawn from commercial satellite imagery and open-source analysis, is unambiguous on the physical facts. Approximately 600 meters of scorched ballast, multiple cistern shells collapsed or contorted beyond serviceability, the track itself warped by sustained heat at multiple points. Ukraine's general staff, in statements from late 2025, referenced operations against Russian fuel logistics in Crimea without specifying this engagement by name. Standard practice for operational security. Open-source accounts citing Ukrainian HUR sources describe the line as out of service for a minimum of 9 days, requiring track replacement ballast clearing, and rail geometry realignment before traffic could resume. 9 days, against a flow-based fuel supply system with limited stockpile buffers at the receiving airfields. The effect on Russian air operations at Dzhankoy and Saki during that period is assessed by Western analysts reviewing sortie tracking data and open-source flight monitoring as measurable. Sortie rates from both fields show a reduction in the days following the strike. Whether that reduction is directly attributable to the fuel disruption or to other operational factors is assessed with moderate confidence, not certainty. What open-source flight data suggests is consistent with a fuel rationing posture. Fewer sorties, shorter patrol durations, a higher proportion of sorties originating from airfields further north, outside Crimea, that draw fuel through alternative supply routes. A Russian Su-30SM costs approximately $30 to $50 million. Keeping it on the ground through fuel denial costs, by Ukrainian estimates, roughly zero marginal expenditure beyond what was already spent on the strike itself. The entire operation, partisan asset placement, charges, FPV platforms, coordination, likely cost a fraction of a single aircraft sortie. This is the asymmetry that defines the Ukrainian deep strike campaign against Russian logistics. Here is a take that invites disagreement. The Western discussion of Ukrainian long-range strike capability has focused almost entirely on Western-supplied systems, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, the Scalp EG. Those systems matter. But the quiet, consistent degradation of Russian logistics through partisan sabotage, coordinated with drone strikes, may be generating more cumulative operational effect per dollar spent than any precision munition. The Novoaleksivka strike cost a fraction of a single ATACMS round. It took 9 days of the Crimea rail line. That trade is, by any military accounting, favorable. What do you think? Is the partisan plus drone model more strategically significant than the precision missile campaign? Or does it only matter because the missile campaign keeps Russian air defenses occupied? The answer is not obvious, and the comments will run in multiple directions. If you track the evolution of this war seriously, the shift from massed armor to drone swarms, from frontline attrition to deep logistics interdiction, you already see the pattern. Subscribe. We break down a new frontline engagement every week, and the next one covers how Ukrainian sea drones forced a change in Russian Black Sea Fleet doctrine that Western analysts are only beginning to map. The Russian response to the Novoaleksivka strike followed a predictable sequence: increased rail patrol frequency in the occupied zone, additional electronic jamming assets deployed near key infrastructure points, and, according to open-source accounts, a review of scheduling practices for fuel echelons, including the use of decoy consists. Whether that review produced meaningful operational security improvements is uncertain. The fundamental problem Russia faces is structural. Its logistics in Crimea run through a limited number of choke points. The rail network is not redundant the way a road network might be, and Ukrainian intelligence collection against those choke points has been running continuously since 2022. Hardening a target does not eliminate the threat when the threat can afford to wait and observe. Partisan networks with years of embedded access to the rail system do not disappear because patrol frequency increases. They adapt their timing. They watch longer before acting. They accept longer intervals between operations in exchange for higher confidence that the window is open. One detail from the open-source reconstruction of this strike that stayed with us: the satellite imagery shows the burn scar running in a curve. The geometry of the track at the point the charge was placed. That curve was not accidental. A curved section amplifies the lateral force when a derailing locomotive transmits momentum through a jackknifing consist. Whoever selected the placement point understood the physics. This was not a team improvising in the field. This was a team that had studied the target, understood the mechanics, and selected for maximum effect. The Russian rail crew had no warning before the detonation. Their emergency response, attempting to uncouple burning cisterns, was tactically correct but operationally futile. Against a pre-positioned FPV swarm, movement within the rail corridor was not survivable for high-value targets. The rational choice, in retrospect, was immediate evacuation. But crews cannot know in the moment whether they are facing a single ground charge or a coordinated follow-on strike. That uncertainty is itself a weapon. It slows the emergency response. It creates hesitation during the window when uncoupling might otherwise succeed. By the time the Russian military had assessed the full scope of the damage and dispatched a repair convoy, the FPV teams had long since displaced. Open-source accounts note no Russian pursuit operation was documented in the Novooleksivka area in the days following the strike. The partisan assets that placed the charge were not found, or if they were, Russia did not publicize it. If you track this war seriously, if you follow the open-source damage assessments, the satellite imagery releases, the Oryx equipment loss counts that now record over 3,000 Russian tanks lost since 2022, you already understand what this strike represents in the larger pattern. It is not an anomaly. It is a node in a deliberate campaign to make Russian logistics in Crimea expensive to operate and uncertain to rely on. The Kerch Bridge, struck by Ukrainian naval drones and later by missiles, remains partially functional but degraded. The rail corridor through Novooleksivka is the secondary route that Russian planners have increasingly depended on, as the bridge's capacity has been constrained by security measures and damage. Striking that corridor, even temporarily, compounds the pressure on a logistics system already running without adequate redundancy. Here is the doctrine lesson this engagement offers for any military studying the 2025 operational environment. Rail interdiction is back. For 2 decades after the Cold War, Western military doctrine largely moved away from deep rail interdiction as a primary campaign line, partly because the adversaries most likely to be fought, non-state actors, insurgent networks, did not rely on rail logistics. Russia does. China does. North Korea does. The Novooleksivka strike is a data point in a growing body of evidence that rail logistics interdiction, executed through a combination of partisan ground action and precision drone follow-on, can generate strategic effect at tactical cost. A $500 FPV drone is not going to end the war in Ukraine. But 32 burning cisterns on a 9-day rail outage, compounding against a fuel system already stressed by the Kerch Bridge restrictions and prior Ukrainian strikes, degrade the sortie rate at Dzhankoy and Saki. A degraded sortie rate means fewer Su-30SM patrols over the Black Sea. Fewer patrols mean wider windows for Ukrainian naval drone operations. Wider windows affect the Russian Black Sea Fleet's operational posture. The cascade from a coordinated sabotage and drone strike on a fuel train reaches, through a chain of military logic, the Black Sea strategic balance. Put yourself in the position of a Russian logistics planner in Crimea in late 2025. Every fuel echelon is now a potential target. Every consist schedule is potentially compromised. Every routing decision involves a threat calculus that did not exist 2 years ago. The administrative overhead of operating under that threat is real, even when individual strikes fail. And when strikes succeed, when 32 cisterns burn on a single night, the operational effect is not abstract. The Novooleksivka strike does not appear in most Western media coverage of the Ukraine war. It is not a dramatic footage moment. No precision missile arcing across a clear sky. No tank engaging at visible range. It is a 600-meter burn scar on a satellite image, a 9-day rail outage, a reduction in sortie rates that shows up as a statistical deviation in open-source flight tracking data. But this is what systematic logistics interdiction looks like. Incremental, cumulative, and measured against cost, highly efficient. Oryx, the open-source equipment loss tracker, documents over 3,000 Russian armored vehicles confirmed destroyed since 2022. Each one required maintenance, fuel, crew training, and supply chain support. The Russian military's ability to regenerate those losses while simultaneously sustaining operations in Crimea, the Donbass, and across a 1,000-kilometer front depends on logistic systems that are increasingly contested. Novooleksivka is one node in that contest. The rail line reopened, according to open-source monitoring, after approximately 9 days of repair work. Fuel echelons resumed. Russian airfields at Dzhankoy and Saki returned to something approximating normal operational tempo. The war continued. But the question that closed-source analysts are asking, and that we will return to in a future breakdown, is whether the cumulative effect of dozens of operations like Novomoskovka across multiple logistics corridors is reaching a threshold where Russian operational planning must structurally accommodate the threat rather than treating each strike as an isolated incident. That is a different kind of strategic problem. And Ukraine, by all open-source indicators, is deliberately trying to create it. Comment: do you think the partisan drone combination represents a permanent shift in how logistical interdiction campaigns are run? Or is it a window that closes as Russian electronic warfare and patrol density increases? We read every response. What happened to that one maintenance vehicle that reversed and escaped? The only thing that moved away from the burning consist before the FPV swarm arrived is a small detail. But it is the kind of detail that, in an after-action review, tells you something about how a drone team prioritizes targets under time pressure, about the decision-making that happens in the seconds between acquisition and engagement. The truck was not worth the shot. The Cisterns were. That calculation, made in real time over occupied Ukrainian territory in the pre-dawn dark, is the calculus of this war. The line near Novomoskovka is repaired. The burn marks remain in the satellite archive. And somewhere in northern Crimea, at a Russian airbase rationing fuel for Su-30SM sorties, a maintenance officer is working a spreadsheet that does not balance the way it did before that November morning. That is how logistics wars are won. Not in a single dramatic blow, but in the accumulated weight of compounding disruption, each strike building on the last, each 9-day outage adding to the operational debt that Russian planners must eventually reckon with. The next engagement we break down covers Ukrainian sea drone operations in the Black Sea, specifically how a change in Russian fleet routing doctrine in late 2025 tells you more about the war's trajectory than any single headline. If that is the kind of analysis you track, subscribe. The breakdown posts this week.